All right, so what I want to talk about today and what your lab is around is in browsing the user list. Previously, we set up code to browse the list of games or the list of movies, but today I want to talk about, what is this, how do we work with user profiles, okay? So we've started building in some of the authentication pieces. I asked you to build a My Profile page to view your own profile, but today I want to talk about, what are the tools that we need to use, and move towards being able to view other users' profiles, okay? So in some ways it uses tools that you already know, that we are already familiar with, but there's also some new tools that we need to talk about and how those fit in. Okay? So general objectives today, we're going to talk about how to use, are these correct? Yeah, so we already use Firebase Authentication to implement the login and the account creation. We're going to use part of that there. We're going to talk about how we update the profile on user login. We're also going to talk about how we update that profile through editing it, if they're going to go edit their profile, which is actually a topic for the next lab as well. And then we want to talk about browsing the public information, the public profiles of other users. We're going to talk about, what is this idea of tab navigation, bottom navigation, and look at how to implement those kind of navigation structures. Namely, that comes into peer navigation, which what we've done so far is child and parent navigation. You're navigating down the hierarchy, but when we do tabbed and bottom, we're talking about navigating horizontally between peers, between things that are at the same level. We'll talk about using fragments and creating our own fragments, because that's related to how we implement tab navigation or bottom navigation. That requires us to use fragments, and how to use that together. Okay, so there's some reading material that's related to this in terms of working with authentication. There's the main article, Managing Users, in the authentication phase. There's under Firestore. There's the adding article related to adding and updating data. That's also factors into some things we'll talk about here in terms of what happens when the user logs in. How do we get that data into the user's collection in the first place? And then, managing that. From the navigation side, you can see I've referred to a bunch of different articles. Some of these are in material design guidelines. Some of these are on Android developers. Some of these are in the API documents related to the tab navigation and the bottom navigation that we'll be talking about today. Also in there, there's a bunch of articles here. This is the tutorial for Fragments. So I've put a few of the parts in there that are relevant to what we're doing today, what we're talking about. And finally, one thing to mention, and I added these late because I forgot about them, there are some, because fragments are becoming a more important thing in the Android world, there's been some discussion on them in recent Google I/Os, which is Google's annual developer conference. So one of the first ones where they talk about them is here in 2016. They talked about what is a fragment. That's where they were kind of just starting to take off and starting to be something that people could use. But in 2018, there's 2 videos that I've posted there, which are much more up to date on what's happening today. And one of the things that's happening in the world today, just to keep you in the loop, we've got this idea of React. We talked about working with React in 3rd semester. We talked about working with React in I think you did it in 1st semester this time through. Remember that it's, first of all, you're talking about the imperative versus declarative switch. We've already started to see some of that with the live data switch. The other thing that React does, it's a single page application. You might remember that name. Let's see, so Angular, Vue, and React, if I remember right, all 3 of those are building single page applications, meaning that basically there's only one HTML file, right? There's one HTML file, and the rest of the logic is handled by JavaScript. So rather than when you have a multi-page app, you actually going between different pages or submitting forms that are changing the page, actually the URL is being changed from JavaScript, right? It's all really just one page, even though it looks like many, right? We put the racked router in there. You couldn't tell the difference between there being one HTML file and 10, right? Why did we do that? Well, there's a few benefits that we got from doing that with React. With React, we went to that because it allows us to be a lot more dynamic. It means that we can download things much more smoothly and create smoother transitions, because it's entirely switching from one HTML file to another HTML file kind of is like throwing away the entire UI that you have and building it back up from scratch, and it's virtually impossible to have the screen be white in between, right? Or to have nice transitions between the two. So if we're on a single page, it's much easier for us to provide good animations and good user-friendly handling, and in fact, in a lot of ways, be more efficient with how we deal with gathering data and requesting data, etc. So there's a lot of benefits to that. Well, it turns out if you follow the kind of path that Android's on, Android's moving closer and closer to React, actually, is what I've seen in recent years. Is they're moving to be closer and closer to the same idea, because it turns out a lot of those principles apply really well to Android development and mobile development in general. So there's actually a push in the Android community towards single activity, right? Just like we've got single page application, we're moving towards single activity applications in the Android world, where rather than having a bunch of different activities, what we have is different fragments, right? So fragments are kind of in the process of being a replacement for activities in a lot of cases. Not entirely in every case, and there's really good explanations. So if you watch the one listed under number 18 and 19, those are some really good introductions to what's going on, right? What is happening with using fragments in your UI, and what is this single activity thing? Why would you want to use it? What are the problems you have to solve if you do go down that route? I haven't fully switched the curriculum over to that model yet, for two reasons. A, first of all, it's not really documented well yet. B, you do still have to learn activities, because there are still cases where you need to change the activity. So it's not a full replacement, and it's just easier to learn it and start with it, understanding activities, before you step up to the new model that's Fragments. Okay, so there's a lot of shifting coming in there. That means that there's modern applications use a lot of fragments and very few activities. Okay, so like Facebook, if you looked at their source code, you might find that they have 1 to 5 activities for the entire app, not an activity for every screen, right? But they would have, if you look at Facebook, you would find hundreds of fragments, right? Single-digit activities, but hundreds potentially of fragments, because there is so much functionality there. Cool. So if you have the time, these are not short videos. I think this one's 45 minutes long, and this is 40 minutes long, because they're sessions. They're Google I/O sessions, but absolutely watch them. They'll be really eye-opening if you have that time. Okay, they're doing things beyond the level of where I'm asking you to do things today, but they'll give you a sight of where the industry's kind of headed. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about authentication and review the pieces that we've talked about already. So previously, we introduced FirebaseAuth into our system, and we're using that to do our logins, remember. And specifically in the API, we've got this function FirebaseAuth.getInstance.getCurrentUser, right? Remember, we've already introduced this function. That will give you the information about the user that's currently logged into your system, right? So things we can get from there include the user's ID, we can get their display name, we can get their email address, we can find out if their email address is verified, and we can get a URL for their profile image, right? So all of that stuff is kind of already baked in. One thing to be wary there, and realize though, is that only gives you information about the currently signed in user. That method does not give me a way to find out any information about anyone else in the system. Is everybody with me there? Okay. In fact, the way this is structured, FirebaseAuth basically has its own database that is separate from Firebase Store, right? You have your Firestore database where you can access and query and freely work with data, whatever's in there, and we can apply security rules to control who can read that data or who can modify it. But that is much more restrictive over in the FirebaseAuth side of things, because that's where all the passwords and other login credentials are stored, so you don't want people to have freely access to those things. In fact, things like somebody's email address or phone number are in that authentication database. We typically don't want to make that stuff public. Does that make sense? So what you kind of consider what's in the FirebaseAuth, just a fair forewarning, assume unless the user said, hey, I want to share that information, assume that information is typically private. Okay, so typically speaking, the safest thing to do is say, hey, if you want to bring any of that data over and make it public, usually you need to ask the user and say, are you okay with me? You have to create that public profile, and it's usually from a limited set of the data you provide, right? There's a question asked when we started this of like, well, what happens if you want to add additional data? Well, part of that is if we add additional data, we don't store that in the auth database, we store that in Firestore, right? Makes sense? So the users kind of have almost, there's going to be some user information in authentication and some information in the Firestore database. Cool? That starting to make sense? Getting kind of the picture? What that means is I can't use this FirebaseAuth class to browse the user list. I can't see anybody else's profile. I can see some of my own information, but nothing from anybody else. And that's important from security. Okay. Yeah.
So, is it still possible to set up, like, how some website you can log in with either like a username or email?
Yep.
Can you store that in Firebase?
Well, we kind of already have. Remember, we already have that system, right? We enabled the email provider and the Google provider, right? So we've already got the option you can log in with multiple providers, right? We already have set that up by providing 2 different sign-in methods. Okay. The difference is in how do you make that information public, right? Not just the login process. Past that, what about public profiles? Is what we're talking about today. Make sense? So, how do we extract that and set those things up? So again, remember email and profile. Email and phone number are both in there. We typically want to keep those private. And we don't have a way to add custom fields, as I mentioned. Was there anything else here? Yeah. So the question then becomes, is what I have here at the end of the list, how do we, now that we've got that, how do we get this data into the database? Namely, we want to get a public profile into the database. And then also, once we've got it there, how do we keep it up to date? Right? So that's question number 1 that we have to tackle before we can even get into being able to look at other people's profiles. It's like we have to talk about how do I get the data there in the first place, and then how do I keep it up to date? Cool? So obviously, remember in the authentication process, when the user logs in, remember that the API that we have allows the user to do a bunch of things, right? So the user can register an account, they can log in with an existing account, whether that be with Google or with email, or they can even reset their password through that place. They can do a password reset, and they can also do, if they say log in with email and then later try to log in with Google, it will actually link those 2 accounts. We'll go ahead and link the account, so even logging in might change their information. Does that make sense? So on login, we have to kind of assume there may be some new data there, and that user might not be in the database yet. Does that make sense? Because we don't know the difference between, you can't tell the difference between somebody registering an account, a logging account, and we really don't want to make that distinction anyway. We just want to say logging in and registering have the same result, right? So whatever way they go through, we have to kind of start with the base assumption that some of their data may have changed. Every time they log in, some of their data might have changed. Their name might have changed, their email address might have changed, their profile photo might have changed. The one thing that won't have changed is their user ID. Everything else they might have changed in that login process. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's one important thing we have to keep in mind. So the way I would start with that is I would say, well, let's just start in terms of getting things into this user collection and building it out. Let's start by saying when the user logs in, anytime they log in, we're going to insert into the user's database. Does that make sense? Inserts in the user's table. So they log in, we're going to immediately take some of that data and create or update a user's document, okay? And so that way that user's document is then going to be their public profile, right? Whatever is in that user's document is going to be what we kind of publicly see of them. It might not be all of their public profile, but at least be some parts of it. Make sense? Okay. So how can I do that? Well, we've already, when I previously set up to have you do is when we logged in, we implemented this on login success function in login activity. And I kind of already teased at that point, the reason we wanted to make that function is later we may want to add some more things to it, right? We may want to set up additional pieces. The login process, the registration process, may need to have some additional steps to it. So let's go ahead and set that up. And so remember, on login success is called both if you go through the UI and log in, it also gets called if you've previously logged in or just automatically skipping you past the login screen. Make sense? We made sure that we called them in both places, and that is important because we want to make sure that it always goes through this. No matter how you get to the main activity, we want to make sure that you get your information updated. Okay. So here's kind of some example code of how I might set it up. Let me see if I can zoom this in a little bit. Reset. So first things first, we want to get data over from auth into the Firestore, okay? So we've already asked it to pass through the user. That user we got from FirebaseAuth. In here, I'm going to open up a connection to the database. I'm going to pick off the public profile information that I want. So namely, I need their ID, so I'm getting that first. I want their display name, because I'm going to make that part of the public profile. I also want their avatar or their photo URL. I want that to be part of the URL as well. One thing that some of you run into when you're trying to put the photo in there, remember that Firebase doesn't actually understand how to insert URIs or URLs. All it understands is strings, right? And so if you try to insert that URI object that you get from photo URL, it will fail to insert or update the document in the database. So one thing I need to do is call toString on that URI to get it to something that I can insert. Everybody good with me? So that's part of what I'm doing here, is I'm going to use a ternary to say, hey, if it's not null, will let me call toString, save the string. Otherwise, it's null because if they're logging in with just their email, they may not start with a profile photo, versus if they log in with their social, more than likely if they log in with Google or Facebook or Twitter, they're going to have some sort of avatar information already. So sometimes it may be null and sometimes it may not be. You have to kind of be aware of that. Cool? So always make sure that you're checking for null on that. So once I've captured the user's data, I can make a hash map. I can make a map of what are the fields that we want to update in the database. Right? Anytime we want to insert data or update data, we've kind of seen this process already. So I want to say, let's set the display name to the user's display name that we got from their user object. We'll set the photo URL to what we got from the user's object. And we'll also set a timestamp on here called last login, which will be when did they just log in? What is the current time? Well, that's really helpful if we do that on login, because now we have a record of like, oh, they haven't logged in 5 days or whatever, if I add this as part of the process that happens when they start the app, right? So that also helps me, right? It's a good reason to go ahead and do an insert anyway, just to get that field updated. Everybody on track with that? So I'm building up a little bit of data I want to insert. In terms of then getting it into the database, is kind of just like working with any other collection, right? We want to insert into user library. We want to insert into reviews. We say db.collection users. I say document.user ID. So the ID of that document is just user ID, because in the user's collection, I want to make sure that for every user, there's exactly one document. And that exactly one document should have the same ID as their user ID over in the authentication database. That way I can easily link them up, right? So that's important, that the document ID is that and nothing else. Automatic IDs are not a good thing. Combining it with anything else is not a good thing. I strictly want it to be one for one with the user ID. Cool? So we're using that as the document ID. The next thing I do is I call set, and I'm going to tell it to, that's how we're going to insert or update the data that's there. So remember that set, if the document isn't there, we'll insert a new document. Or if it is already there, set will override that document. We'll replace it with the data that we just gave it. Does that make sense? Now there's a little bit of a problem with that. Because what if their user profile has more than just those 3 fields? What if their user profile has more than display name, photo URL, and last login? Maybe there's other fields on the user document we want to maintain, right? So if we just use set, normally all of that data would be lost. All those additional fields would be removed from the document. And I think you can see why that might be a problem, right? So all I want to update is these small set of fields when they log in and not anything else. So that's why I'm adding the option here, set options.merge. And what that says is say, merge it with the existing document. So if there already is a document, leave all those fields alone. Just change the fields that I've told you to change. Does that make sense? So that one little bit of the options is super, 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 super important. Okay, we haven't done that in the previous things. I did talk about it in a previous lecture, but we haven't used it since then. So I want to emphasize that little piece, that second argument to set, is super important for this. Does that make sense? Otherwise, every time they log in, they lose all of the rest of their profile information, which means it makes it impossible to really add anything else. Yeah.
Isn't there an update, like a dot update?
There is a dot update, I believe, but then that would also indicate that you know that the document is there. We, at this point at login, we don't know if the document is there or is not. In fact, it could be, you have to think, because we're working with NoSQL, we have to be very resilient and plan for things that might be unexpected, such as what happens if the user has previously created an account, but there's not a profile for them yet in the user's database. So they're just logging in, but they still need to create a profile because this code wasn't in there previously, which is actually where we are today, right? You've already registered accounts with your system, but when you registered that account, it didn't populate the user's database, right? So we do need to do inserts even on login scenarios because that document may not be there yet. Make sense? Right? We can't rely on just that it's going to be an update. It might be an update or insert. I don't know.
So you would never really want, you would always want to use this method.
I would always want to use set here. Absolutely never use update, right? It would always be set, right? Always set, no add, no update. It's definitely going to be set here. Cool? For that reason alone, right? That reason alone, you don't know ahead of time which it's going to be. From there, I need to see is it successful or failure. There's a bunch of ways, by the way, to listen for that. One way you can do that is with the onComplete listener, which will kind of combine the success and error. But in some of these code examples, you'll see me starting to split it up and using a different method. So here I'm using two separate listeners, one for the success case and one for the failure case. Do make sure you always add both. Because we always care about if something fails, okay? That's never something we should ignore. At minimum, if something goes wrong, if there's an error, we should at minimum always log it, one way or the other. We need to record that it occurred. Because otherwise, when you go back to troubleshoot this, it looks like everything's working just fine, and there's no errors in your logs. Make sense? Okay, so because this insert can succeed or fail, usually it's going to succeed or fail because of your security rules. So for instance, if you haven't set up your security rules right, then that insert, you're going to get failure here. You want to be able to see that, oh, my permissions are wrong. Okay. So in this case, we've successfully inserted or updated the profile, their public profile. In the other case, we failed. There's a good question here. In this failure, so in this case, you notice where I'm doing the start activity. Okay. Previously, I'd done the start activity up just at the top of this function because that was the first thing, the only thing that this function was doing. Notice that I'm postponing start activity until we finish the insert. That's important. You see that? So I'm actually delaying. I'm delaying the bit of code that goes to the main screen or the game list until this is finished. It means you're going to take a little bit longer to log in, but it means that once you get logged in, we know that your data is in a good state. Make sense? So what about failure, right? What do I do in the failure case? Well, obviously I need to log the error. Notice here I've chosen to go ahead and start the activity anyway. Why might I want to do that? Yeah.
I mean, they successfully logged in, so you don't want to just tell them, hey, you can't use the app even though we can't save your updated profile.
Right. Because most of our features in the app still work, even if their profile is not updated. So I probably don't want to completely shut them out just because that one part isn't, because my security rules are wrong, right? So which is usually going to be the case, right? So I want to go ahead and let them go through, right? What are some other options that I could take here? What are some other options of what I could do in the failure scenario? Instead of sending them to the next activity, what could I do? Well, I could give them an error, right? I could show an error in the UI or a snack bar or whatever, just to say, hey, we failed to update your profile or something's wrong. Try again later or contact our customer support. I could say that, right? And I think it depends a little bit on what your industry is, right? So if we're talking about usual consumer industry, like we're talking with the game library, probably I want the users to go ahead and continue using the app, right? But what if this is something that's more, needs to be more secure, right? Say that you're working with government systems or medical systems or financial systems. Auditing is really important, right? If I haven't recorded when you logged in, I have actually missed an important part of the audit. Does that make sense? Because I might want to do things in here, like record your current GPS address, right? I might want to, when you log in, record what your GPS coordinates are, put that in the database, so later I can audit and make sure nobody got into the system that shouldn't. Well, if that fails, I don't have that history. Does that make sense? So if you're in that scenario where like you really care about, hey, I don't want to let just anybody get into the system. I need to be able to see if somebody fraudulent got into the system, then I'd much rather show an error in the error case rather than proceeding on. Does that make sense? You know, there's things in here you really have to consider from what is the specific case, what is the specific audience that you're part of. Make sense? right? So in, like, let's say, I mean, we were talking about Security Plus and talking with Leidos, they would not be okay with you starting an activity here. That needs to be an error, right? But for us, we're doing more consumer things right now that we're going to go ahead and proceed with that. A few things I want to note on that example code. Notice that I've used a map to update the database. Previously, I did mention that you can use your custom objects to insert in some cases. This is not one of those cases. If I try to construct like a user object or user profile object and insert that, that's going to update every field in the user profile. The only way to say that I want to update some of the fields but not all of them is to use a map. Is that very clear with that? So this is something you cannot use that shortcut. You have to use a map for this case. Okay. Also, again, remember I had to use that merge option. That's also really critical. That happens so you're not wiping out other data. So those are some things to pay attention to. I kind of mentioned this already. This is an asynchronous operation. It doesn't complete immediately. So if I were to put the start activity down at the bottom of this function, it would be happening. It would be going to the login screen before this finishes. So that's what I have to move the start activities into the success and the failure callbacks. Does that make sense? So that's one thing to be very, very wary of and pay attention to, right? Is that you're dealing with asynchronous operations. Okay. And we kind of talked about this, you know, what's the best way to deal with errors? Usually it's either to show it and block the login, or it would be potentially to just proceed, which that's the case I'm doing in that example. So that actually most of the time, just adding that one bit into on login success, that will actually take care of most of the updating we need to do. That will get us to a point where, okay, once our users have logged in, they now have a user document within the users collection. We can start, that will give us a way to start to browse it. Remember though that later the user may want to change their profile. They might want to change their display name. They might want to change their profile image. They might want to change other parts of their account. So in order to do that, we may have to put some additional code in to satisfy that. And so typically the place where you would find this is under my profile activity. So if I go to my own profile, I might want to be able to update my own information, and that's the point where you would see this kind of code. Cool? So one of the phase, we're talking about phase 9 today. Phase 10 is the next part. One of the things that's going to happen in phase 10 is I'm going to ask you to update their profiles, their profile images. So some of this code that we're talking about right here today is going to be in phase 10, just as a heads up. But I'm just putting it here for context. Okay. So in terms of if the user wants to update, say, their display name, which is the example I have here, I might want to add a function to my view model. Specifically, this would be my profile view model. I'd say maybe let's call this update display name in auth, right? So I want to update it in the authorization database, okay? So the API to update data in the authorization database is a bit different from the one to update data in the Firestore database. But recognize if we want to make changes to, say, their display name, we're storing that 2 places, we need to update both places, okay? Because remember, every time they log in, we copy the one from auth into the one to the database, right? So if we just update the database and don't update auth, when they log in, they'll keep losing their display name, right? So the way we do that, we need to create this user profile change request. You can see that there's a builder here. So we create a builder. We say set display name. So that says we want to change the display name. We call build, and that will then actually build the object we want. So we make the request first. From there, we go to the current user. We're going to call update profile, pass in that request. So you're not building a map. You're building this request object is how we change data in that database. So things to notice, there's only a limited number of these sets that you can have access to, like set display name or set photo or set email, set phone number, those are the kinds of things you're able to change. You can't just change anything you want. Yeah.
So, display name, that's
Yeah.
coming from like whatever method they chose to log in with. Like for instance, if you log in with the email, it's going to show the email. If you log in with Facebook, it'll be like your name.
So the display name, if you log in through email, it gives you a prompt. It says first and last name. So it's whatever you entered in that field, okay? If you go through Google or Facebook or Twitter, then it's your name on that social media site. It's your public name on that social media site. So it might be your full name, or it could actually be anything the user wants it to be, okay? So one thing just to be clear with, that display name is meant to be public in general, but you can't assume that it's first and last name, okay? You can't make the assumption that it always has that format. Cool? So you may have to do some work. If you really need it to be that, then you're going to need to have the user actually enter it that way. Okay. So I call the update profile, and again, I need to handle the success and failures. Okay. So that's how I can update it. And if I need to update their display name, change their display name, that's how I would do it in the authorization side. Yes.
The only real reason why we're updating the profile on login is because we are using providers, right?
The reason we're doing it on login is a few reasons we talked about. First of all, with that login, that might be their first login, in which case there's no information in the users. It might be that our schema's changed, and so we need to insert it because the schema's changed. Insert updated information. We're also doing it because we're tracking that timestamp of when is the last time they logged in. So
this is common then. This is common?
Yeah, this is common. So there's several bits of functionality that we're getting by doing the insert on login. Okay. And it turns out that those are important enough that you're basically going to see this in every scenario. Tracking when people log in is so important for virtually any application that you're going to see that. One of the reasons that comes up is just having that one timestamp of when they last logged in gives you a bunch of things. It gives you some security bits in terms of checking for unauthorized users. It gives you the ability to see, hey, here's a user that hasn't logged in for 30 days. That's an indication that I may be losing users, or users are losing interest, or there may be some issues with yada yada my system. So business people care about that. How many days it's been since they last logged in is really helpful from a business perspective. It's also just a case of, well, what happens if I have a bunch of users that say haven't logged in 2 years? It's actually really important, right? So let's say I have these users that haven't logged in 2 years. First of all, I probably can stop sending most of those users emails in most cases. If I am sending them emails, I'll send them maybe less often, and I'll send specific kinds of emails to those users because we haven't seen them in 2 years, encouraging them to come back. Does that make sense? So in terms of marketing and ad campaigns and things like that, I really care about knowing how long it's been since they used their account. And I also may say at some point, hey, I haven't seen this users in 5 years. Why am I keeping their data around? Because at some point it's just like, they're never going to come back. Let's delete their account. That happens. So there's a bunch of things that just having that timestamp of when they last logged in enables you to do that business people care tremendously about, and you'll find this in the industry. Cool. So it's the cost of doing it is so cheap that it's always worth it, is the kind of thing. The amount that you get by logging the time they last log in, the amount of things that you can get out of that is so much more than what it costs to do it, so just do it, kind of thing. Yeah.
This is, I guess, kind of off topic, but I'm just going to assume that oftentimes, like, our users, like, IP addresses logged and stuff like that.
A lot of systems do, but that's usually never automatic. Okay. A lot of systems do that, but some developer had to make that happen. right? So there's nothing that automatically does that. Like Firebase doesn't automatically log your IP address every time you log in, at least not in a way that you as a developer can get access to it. Google's probably logging it for their own purposes, but they may not give you access to that database. So if you need that history of their IP address every time, or their GPS address every time, their GPS location every time, you as a developer have to write that code, right? You have to put that into the database somewhere, and you have to do all the bits and pieces and permissions and stuff that's required to make that happen, right? So it's a common need, but it's not something you get out of the box. It's not terribly hard to build, but it is something you have to build, right? IP address is something you typically can get their IP address without asking for permission. You can just say, hey, I want it. Well, we're talking over the network, so inherently you had to send your IP address. You might be masking it with a VPN, but there's no stopping from me at least taking whatever the IP address is that you presented me and putting it in the database. GPS on a different side is not the same thing. You don't get that automatically. You do have to get permission to get somebody's GPS coordinates. So that can be anywhere from putting uses permissions. Historically was the way you would do that in the manifest. You'd say uses permissions and put the appropriate permissions there. But the way it is now with modern devices, if you want location access, you actually have to do that in code, and you have to say at this time, hey, I want location access. So on your newer Android devices, you'll see, hey, this app, when you're using it, it might pop up and say, hey, I need location access. And we'll give you a allow or deny. That's what's happening there. There's also another gradation in there with newer devices, which is like, do you want to give it access to your location all the time or just when you're using the app? From a privacy standpoint, from a security standpoint, I would really recommend for most things only when you're in the app, if at all. Turns out your location gives you a lot of information about you, especially if it's available to that app all the time. So there's only a few things that I give access all the time to, like Google Maps, where I may need to be able to navigate and use it even when I'm not in the app. But there's very few things that get that permission. Okay, so on the other side of updating in the other database, we looked at just how to update the display name in auth. Here I'm going to do another function that updates it in the database. So get the current user, make a simple have update. Here I say the only field I want to update is their display name, so that's the only thing I'm putting in the map, right? So like if you say, hey, what are the fields the user wants to simultaneously update on their profile, you just put those things in the map, just the things you want to change. From there, I'm saying, let's go to that document with that user ID, and notice again I'm doing a merge because I only want to update the display name and not completely replace the document, okay? If I didn't put that one merge option in here, then all of their other data outside of the display name would be lost. Everything else in that user document would be gone. Make sense? Everybody with me there? So that's kind of like the two different ways you can see in terms of updating the auth and in terms of updating the user database, right? So we'll need to put this kind of code in to keep things in sync, okay? Now notice that both of these things can succeed and fail independently, right? So you might succeed at updating auth, but not succeed at updating the database. You might succeed at updating the database, but not updating auth, okay? Now, I can write these as two separate functions, but writing them as two separate functions makes it harder to deal with the case where one succeeds and one fails, right? So I wouldn't necessarily want to write it this way. Other languages have provided some utilities to work through this. So like, for instance, in JavaScript, I can start these both as promises, and I might say, hey, here's the one that updates the auth, and I've got another one that updates the database. These are my two promises, right? And independently to those, I can have my own callbacks or my own resolves. But in JavaScript, we can do, say, what I can do is promise dot all, and what I can do is pass those in as an array. Promise. Dot then. Dot catch. So in the JavaScript world, it's pretty easy to split these up into two functions because we have this sort of structuring. And I can say, okay, this then will only get called if both of these succeed. Catch will get called if either one of them fails. Okay, so we have some tools. Those tools don't exist in JavaScript, right, or Java. Java does not have a way to easily, built into the language, both either Java or Android, does not have an easy way to say, here's two things I want to do, two asynchronous operations I want to do, and let's handle together the failure, right? Let's handle the case where one of them succeeded and one of them failed, or both failed, etc. It doesn't provide any functionality for that out of the box. Okay, there are things you could construct. There are things you could play around with live data to try and make these kind of things happen. But this is kind of a hard problem in the world of Android to try to do two operations at the same time and then handle the results. Okay. So what I often find easier to do is to do them in sequence. So I say, go do this, and then go do this thing afterward. Okay. Now, one thing to recognize is that's actually a little bit harder than it might seem. Because if I call these two functions, if I say call update display name and auth, and then I call the second function, just back to back. So I say function 1, function 2. If I call these two functions just like this, that's not going to guarantee that they kind of happen in sequence. It's going to mean that they're both started at the same time, but it imposes no stipulations about which one's going to finish first. Okay, this one might finish first, that one might finish first. Right? And in fact, I have no way of saying, like, well, what was the result of those things, right? So, because remember, the result comes to these callbacks, right? Comes to these callbacks, the success and failure callbacks in both of these sites. Make sense? So what I really need to do is something more, if I want to call these things sequentially, I have to kind of say, okay, do this first thing and pass in a callback. So boop, boop, and say kind of when you're done, run function 2. Right? Go run function 1, and then when function 1 is done, then call my callback, and then the callback I'll call function 2. So I have to inherently nest these things to get them to happen in sequence. I can't actually write them top to bottom. I have to do nesting. Does that make sense? If I write these functions as I've written them, there's no way for me to nest them, right? Because I can't just say call this function in here, or call this function in there. I haven't provided a facility to do that. If I had passed in maybe a callback in here, right, as an argument, then I might have been able to set that system up. Okay? So the way I would write this process instead is this way. So here I've got a single update display name function. And this function is going to update it in both the authentication database and the Firestore database. You got a hand up, Evan?
No, I'm listening.
Okay. So here I'm saying first thing I want to do is go get the current user. Now, In the other one, I'd forgotten to check if there was a current user at all, because maybe you're not logged in, but I'm going to do that here. So here I'm going to say, okay, well, if the user's null, we're already done, right? There's no way for us to update either database if you're not even logged in, because you don't have permissions. You shouldn't have permissions, right? We can't obviously update the auth database because you don't have a user, and we can't update Firestore because we don't know which user to update, right? So if that happens, we're done. Log an error, tell the user that there's a problem, we're out of here because you're not authenticating, okay? That's important because some of these, when you try to write these out, it will give you some warnings and say, hey, user might be null. Well, that deals with that, right? So we have that first case we have to deal with. Next thing I'm doing is I'm going to go ahead and set up the instructions for both updates that we need to do. So I've got a request object to update the display name in the auth database. I've got a map to update it in the Firestore database. Cool? I go initiate current user update profile. I say, let's go start the update on the auth. Within there, then I'm saying, okay, let's add a success listener. If we successfully update it in the auth database, then I'm going to go make the update in the Firestore database. Does that make sense? So I'm having this one update conditional on the first one succeeding. And so if this one fails, then I just go straight down here. There's a problem. Let's tell the user about it. We failed to update the auth database. We're done. Why am I doing that in that order? Why am I updating auth before I update Firestore? Well, remember the login function that we set up previously is copying your display name from auth into Firestore, right? So if I fail to update auth, there's no point in going ahead and updating the database because it'll get wiped out the next time you log in. Does that make sense? So I have to update auth first because that's our source of truth. Does that make sense? Because auth is our source of truth, we need to update auth first. If auth fails, then we're done. If auth succeeds, then I go in here. So the case where both have been done is in the combination of that. So you see add-on success listener is inside here. So this is the case where we've updated both databases. Does that make sense? Both updates have occurred. Okay. So anytime you have this where you need to do two changes, two databases, two collections, two documents, you're going to need to make sure you nest the code and nest the callbacks, right? So like we have an outer function, which is update display name. Within that, we've got a smaller function, which is our on success listener. Within that, we've got a smaller function, which is this also on success listener, right? So it's nested 3 calls deep, okay? Where this function calls another function, calls another function. It's just not as obvious sometimes because you're passing functions to other functions. That's what we're doing when we do this callback. Okay? Cool? Does that make sense? So that's how we would update the database if we needed to update it some other time. Say we were going to update it in my profile. That's what your code is going to look like with this nested structure. Cool? Okay. I want to make sure that I mentioned that and talked about how that update happens. So that's how we're going to deal with keeping things up to date. We'll run this kind of code after login, when the user changes their profile, and we'll also run the other code at login every time. Okay, security rules real quick, because obviously we've got this new collection, this new users collection. We need to make sure that we secure it. Remember, by default now, our rule says, by default, you're not allowed to do the thing. So if I don't put in security rules, you will be prevented. Okay. So security rules I'm going to put in here, I'm going to say, okay, let's go to the users collection, user ID. So all the documents in the users collection. We're going to just say allow read. We're going to say these documents in the users collection are all public. If I needed to have some information that was private and some information on my profile that was public, then I would need 2 different documents, right? I need a private profile document and a public profile document. So I need to put those into two separate collections if I had some of the data that was public and some of the data that was private. You'll see that in a lot of places. Facebook has that system, right? The reason you need to do that is because the security rules are for the entire document as a whole. You can't say, hey, you can read these columns, these fields, but not these column fields. So we have to have the entire document either have the same rules, okay? So here we're saying allow read. That's because I don't have a private profile per se. Next thing I want to say is you can create or update your own profile. So that is allowed under the condition that A, you're logged in, and you're updating yourself. So you'll notice I'm using this user ID variable that's part of the path, right? So I'm saying the path, right, if that matches the user ID you're logged in, you're allowed to create and update that, otherwise you're not. So you can't update anybody else. Cool? Pretty simple rule, right? Obviously, if you need to have admins updating other users' profiles or things like that, this would be more complicated because you would have to allow for those admins, but this is enough to get us started, okay? You'll also notice on there that I haven't put any conditions on deleting because in general, your users should not be able to delete their accounts. Just in general, that shouldn't be the case. And in fact, that becomes a little bit more complicated because remember, you've got data here and data there. So if you want the user to be able to delete their account, they need to delete it both from Auth and from Firestore, right? In general, people don't do that. It's very rare that people have access or should even be able to delete their account. In fact, most of the time, accounts are deleted by admins and not by end users. Okay, most of the time when you're deleting an account, it's because you're deleting an account that's just spamming or trolling your website. Which, in that front, is really more likely to go through maybe some of the back-end code, maybe your cloud functions. You're more likely to do a delete through there rather than doing a delete through the front end. So that's part of why I'm just saying, hey, for the moment, we're not going to allow delete. Okay? Cool? Makes sense? A number of people had issues with their rules for users collection. This is what I'm looking for on the users collection. And notice one of the things that makes this different is because this is different because the user ID is the document ID. It's not a field on that document. So everybody hear that? The user ID is not a field of the user's document. It is the ID of that document. And so that's why I'm not saying like .resource or request.resource. I'm not looking at any of the data in the document or any data on the request. I'm just looking at the ID of that document. Okay? So that's the way we want to set up the security rules for this. Pretty simple. Let's talk about how we query users. Because what we're trying to do is trying to then eventually, now that we've got the data in the database, which is mainly what that on login process does, now we can query it. Well, the good news is now that it's over in the Firestore database, we basically already know how to do that, right? We already know how to query the games or the movies or whatever from that collection, so it's the same thing, right? Once I set up the security rules, it's the same idea. So I might say, let's write a function to query the users. Let's start the query as we're going to go to the users collection. I might want to order it by something. Common thing would be the display name, right? We typically don't want to order it by avoid an order clause because it's typically by default going to remember order it by the document ID, but the document ID, the user ID is basically random if you've looked at it. Those user IDs are randomly generated. So we want to make sure we're always ordering, otherwise this list is going to be completely random for all intents and purposes. So make sure you have an order by clause in there. Okay. So order by display name, that's the easiest one to choose. If two users have the same display name, this is going to then fall down to their document ID. So if they have the same, like let's say there's two Paul Smiths in the account, those two Paul Smiths then would be organized by their document ID. Another thing we might do is say ordered by the display name and then last login, right? You could do it that way too. But at least make sure it's ordered by their name, okay? From there, I can do the same thing. Set up a snapshot listener. I'm going to go ask for that, log any errors that occurred, or if it's successful, we're going to go turn these into, say, user profile documents. Should be a class that you need to create, a class that represents that document in there, and do that as we would normally, right? So that part's the easy part, right? Querying the data is kind of the easy part because we've already talked about how to do it. Cool. And you can kind of envision in there, we saw how maybe we filtered by like console, or we filtered by the lists and things like that. Those are things you could do as well. Here, like say, hey, maybe I want a friends list. I could have this implement that sort of code where I could say, hey, I just want my friends list, or hey, I just want people who play on Xbox. I could kind of do the same types of things with this querying process. Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about navigation. We've talked about so far how to deal with the database side of things, right? I talked about how to get it in there with the insert process, updating. We talked about how to query it. Now we need to talk about where are we going to show the list of users in our UI, right? So the kind of workflow that we have so far is that you start with login. You go to the game list. You go to the game details. And from game details, I can go to compose a review. Composing a review takes me back to the game details, right? So far, all I've had is parent-child navigation. We're just navigating further into it. Make sense? Which we can do with intents, right? That's what intents are good at. That's what intents do for us. It allows us to navigate to a child activity. How do we go back up? Right, so we use an intent to start an activity and go down. How did we go backwards? Back up the tree.
Finish.
Finish, right? So we use start activity to go down. And we use finish to go back up. Okay. One screen I forgot to put on here. Where is how do you get to my profile? What screen do you need to go to get to my profile?
As in the little drop down menu button.
Where's the most logical place of these four for you to want to go to and look at your profile? Probably immediately after you log in, right? That's the most sensible place to put that. I think that's where almost everybody's getting, right? Because it's pretty obvious. So if the user is here, they can either go to game details or they can go to my profile. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the way you could navigate throughout. It's good to have that either written out somewhere or mentally in your head. Okay? One thing I want to avoid is things like cycles. I don't want to have the way of the user to kind of go around in circles. So, for instance, it's kind of dangerous if the user can do or get there two ways. So I wouldn't want to do something like this. I wouldn't want to create a link to my profile from both the game list and the game details, because then when I'm here, well, where am I going back to? Well, previous screen, but things start to get confusing, right? And especially gets confusing if you have something like this where you say, hey, I'm going to click on the item in the user's wish list. That takes me to game details, and I can go back to my profile. That's a loop, right? Do you see that? I want to avoid those loops.
So you don't want to put links in the profile then?
I don't want to, I have to be careful, I don't want both of those links, right? If this one has a link to my profile, and this one has a link to the game,
Oh, you don't want both.
you end up continuously going down, and then you can be infinitely deep into the UI, right? So I only want it going one way, right? That means that things like the My Profile link, if you put that in the nav bar and the logout link, I don't want that to be in the entire app, right? The only places where you can log out or look at your profile are on this first screen. Does that make sense to everybody? I'm trying to avoid those cycles. So that just means one of the common mistakes that new developers make is they say, hey, I'm going to put this thing in the menu bar. I'm going to then put that on every screen. Yeah, we don't do that in Android. We put that on the home screen and only on the home screen for a lot of things. Okay. So it's important to know what's kind of your home screen. Yes?
So when you go from an item in like your profile, you said you can go one way, right?
Right.
And don't you always have to have back navigation? Like, isn't that something
Yes,
you
yes,
decide?
you have to have back navigation.
So
But
with
remember, back navigation, when you go back, you're taking something off of your back stack. If you call finish, that removes something from the back stack. Calling start activity adds something to the back stack. We don't want the back stack to grow infinitely. If it grows infinitely, you'll eventually run out of memory, because you only go so deep. So that means I might have a link like this, but I definitely don't want to link back.
Okay.
Right? I don't want to link back from here to my profile. Okay? But I might have a link when you go to your profile. I might want to be able to say, oh, you put in God of War, I'm going to click on God of War and go look at God of War. Right? But as long as that's the case, notice that there's still no loops in here. Did we see that? There's no loop, right? There is two ways to get from game list to compose, right? I can either go through, pick a game, and then down compose, or I can go pick my profile, go to a game, and down to compose. Either of those ways will get me there, but neither of those are a loop. Yeah.
So how does the up navigation work then when you've gotten to game details and there are multiple paths that you got there?
Right. So that's part of why, that's a good question. So that's part of why we have, remember we made the up nav and the back nav behave the same way. Okay. So back nav always goes back in your history.
Oh, okay.
Right? If I have back, the default behavior would be to go the way I got there. Okay. The default behavior for up navigation is to always go to the parent, right? So if I am at game details, back navigation will take me back to whatever screen I came from, but up navigation will always take me back to game list. We changed that intentionally, remember, by saying that home, the up nav behaves the same as back. We did that intentionally, and that's kind of the modern expectation of things. Cool? Make sense? So historically, it would have been this is up and that is back if you came from my profile, but we're making it behave the same way, intentionally. Cool? So that sort of navigation makes sense. Okay. Now, remember what our goal is. I want to be able to add two lists. We have two primary lists now. We have a list of movies or games, and we also are going to have a list of users. Where do we put the list of users? In here. Where do I put the list of users?
Maybe it should be parallel, like a child, not a child, like a peer activity to game list.
Right. So I might, that's you might kind of say it's next to it. Okay. Let's say we just talk about start activity, and let's not talk about peers yet. Let's say it's just a parent and a child relationship.
Oh, okay.
What would it be its parent if I were going to add it into the current scheme? What would it be its parent? Is there more than one way to add it in? Yeah, there's more than one way to add it in. So what are my options? Where could I?
Definitely not compose review and definitely not game details.
You said what?
Definitely not compose review and definitely not game details as
Yeah,
parents.
I probably wouldn't want to go to the user list from either of those screens. Would I want to go there from my profile? Maybe,
Not.
but probably not. Because here I'm just looking at my profile. I probably don't want to go from there. Okay? Would I want to go look at the list of users from the login screen? No, because the only thing we're going from the login screen is the next thing, right? Okay, so one option I can use without changing a bunch of things is I could say from game list you could get to the user list, which kind of is the most sensible thing, right? You say, hey, I can get there from what we would call the home screen of the app, would be the game list, right? So I can go from here to there. Okay, that probably would be some sort of like menu bar option, right? So now up in the menu, let's say we're looking at game list or movie list. I now have 3 icons. I have users, I have my profile, and I have logout. I'd probably put those in as, I would put those in as icons, but I'm having options there, right? Things are starting to get crowded, right? I could totally do that, but things are starting to get crowded. The other side of things, one of the problems with putting users up there is because that's not the main place where users look, right? If they're going to come in and log into my app, they're not immediately going to see this icon up here. But maybe I want them to see it quickly, right? Maybe I want to get them pretty quickly engaged with other users on my system, right? So this creates that sort of behavior. Does that make sense? Okay. So I could do this way, put it in the menu, but now it's another thing in the menu, right? So are there other places that I could put it in? Yeah.
So are you like suggesting that we put users on like a game details page or something, or?
No.
Okay. Not the users that are currently engaged
So
with that game?
in this structure, what screen does the user see immediately after they log in? They see game list, right? So I'm kind of saying the most important screen in this app is the game list, right? What if I say the user list and the game list are equally important? What if I want to say that?
It just doesn't work right now because you said when we log in, we don't want to go to a user list.
Right. So I could, well, you're kind of asking the right question. I could take this out and run the user over here. I could do that. That would kind of say that the user list is more important than the game list, which doesn't really make sense in our app, right? It is important, but what if I want to say they're equally important, right? So one thing I might start doing is I might say, hey, let's add another activity. You go to home, and then from there, you can go from the home screen, you can go either to game list or home user list, right?
Okay.
That kind of menu, that home menu, basically gets us into a place where they're kind of equally important. Does that make sense? So oftentimes we may want to add this sort of home screen. Cool? Is everyone on with me there? So I could add, the way I could do this, and I kind of mentioned this here, a couple more ways to navigate. one way I might do this is add a sort of menu, call that the home screen, that just has 2 buttons, users and games. Right, and so from there you can go to library list. That's pretty easy to implement, and we basically talked about all that you need to know to do that, right? How often do you see that sort of setup in most apps, where there's just a menu as the first thing you log in? There are Android apps that do that.
I've seen one app that's done that.
Yeah.
This one.
Most apps don't do that. Games do occasionally do that. I have seen this pattern in games, where you might go to a menu first, but it's really, really pretty rare, right? Now, I could, on this home screen, put some other stuff, like I could put, maybe on the screen we have things like your most played games, or your friends and rankings of their scores, top players, etc. I could put some other information here and then make it relevant. It's usually not something as simple. If there is a home screen, it's very rarely that it looks like button here, button here. Right? It's very rare that we do that, because it just kind of like, it looks kind of amateurish, and it doesn't immediately capture the user's attention. It's just kind of like meh. So what you might see instead is something like this. See the links at the bottom, right? You have your home screen, whatever, that might have pertinent information, your most important information, and then from there you can click one of the links at the bottom and go further down, right? That's what you might see, okay? In basic understanding of those things, those really aren't that different, right? Having the 2 buttons at the bottom versus having them in the center screen isn't really, in terms of UI, very different, but it's one way that people implement it. Does that make sense to everybody? It's one way that people do that. Okay, so we could do a menu, we can do a home screen. One way we can do that. Also, common patterns that you'll see are what's called tab navigation and bottom navigation. Okay, that's where you have a single screen here, which rather than that having like, here's the home, I might have, hey, without leaving that screen, I can see both games and users. I can see both of those things from the same screen. Right.
So yeah, I was wondering, like, would that require combining the activities, or does that somehow allow you to like access them separately?
So that's a good question. Does it require you to combine those activities into one, like the user list and the game list? Depends, right? So let's think about how I could lay that out, right? So if I have enough space, let's say I'm on a tablet, and here I could say, okay, let's say this side is the list of games, and this side is the list of users. On a tablet, I have enough space to do that, right? I could do that. I could just put both lists in parallel, because I have enough space. I can't do that on a phone, right? I can't do that on the phone. So I might get into a scenario where even doing this, where I have to have one UI for phones and one UI for tablets. Make sense? Right? Okay. How often do you see this sort of UI happening? Again, doesn't happen very often. Why? Because you're always wasting half the screen. Why are you wasting half the screen?
Because you can only be focused on one or the other at a time.
Right. Users never interested in both games and users. They're only interested in one or the other. They're never interested in both simultaneously. So if you try to put these both on the same screen, you're always wasting half the screen.
So I was just wondering, like, so if you had like two separate tabs, like
Yeah.
a tab that had the movie or the game list,
Yes.
and another tab with the user list, like,
Yeah.
this screen, it wouldn't switch between them?
It would
Is
switch.
that-
Yeah,
Okay.
it would switch. That's what we're talking about. Okay, we're talking about the switch thing. So I might do that as, again, options we could do. We could have a menu, like I have home here, and goes down to the user list or game list. Or we can have these two kinds, which we call top tab navigation and bottom navigation,
Okay,
which
so-
are peers, right?
So that would require like a home activity?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
basically the way this works,
Okay.
if I structure it this way, what I'm actually going to do to my UI, if I use either the tab navigation or the bottom navigation, it looks like this. Where home contains both the user list and the game list. It contains both. And you can switch between the two lists. So if I click on a game, I go to game details. If I click on a user, I go to user profile. If I click on my profile, I go to my profile.
Okay.
So this is what I want you to build. This is the UI. This is what I want you to build for today and tomorrow. Right. This is what we're trying to construct. Does that make sense? So we're going to add in a home screen, and we're going to kind of merge both the user list and the game list into that. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so that's what I was asking. So we're basically gonna take like the game list and the user list and just put it all in that single activity?
All in the home activity. Yeah. Not exactly in the activity. Okay. Because we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But basically, if I try to put all that code into the activity itself, there'd be way too much code there. Right? So we're gonna take advantage of some things to actually break it down a little bit. Okay? That's part of where Fragment's gonna be. Right? Allows us to keep the code separate. And technically, we're still gonna have two separate view models. We'll have a game list view model, and we will have a user list view model. Those are actually still gonna be separate view models. So home activity will actually have two different view models effectively that it's connected to. Make sense? That's fine. But that's one of the definite values of having these view models. Yeah.
How seamless is this going to be to transition from having an activity for every single thing?
Uh-huh. So notice these activities are staying around as separate activities.
Mhm,
Same with login. So what's happening is the game list activity is going away and basically being replaced by home.
Okay.
Okay.
So is it still worth to take this approach and build all of them separate and then kind of figure out how you want to lay out the navigation later?
What do you mean?
Like we took this approach of
Mhm.
making everything its own one page and then
Mhm.
having to go up and down the hierarchy. Is it worth doing that? Or?
This is a good question. It's a good question. So if we're doing the kind of the traditional approach, then everything its own activity. What we're moving towards is instead of everything being its own activity, everything it's its own fragment. It's hard to start, depending on where you start with and how you implement it, you might be able to start with everything being its own fragment and start directly there. But there's enough stuff that you have to set up to make that happen that it wasn't really practical for us to start there.
Okay.
Right? It wasn't practical for us to start with fragments. We needed to kind of start with activity and then work our way back. Because otherwise what happens too is if I start with immediately something being in that place, then I would have had we've already have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 activities. We would have had 5 activities, 5 view models, and 5 fragments. It's a lot of code. Right? So I may not want to start there. I may want to start with activities and then refactor to fragments
Okay.
as I find the need to do that. So tab navigation. Tabs allow us to kind of organize as they say, the way they describe them is tab organized contents across different screens, data sets, and other user interactions. So here's an example of what this tab navigation might look like. We've got the application bar up top, and then beneath that, I've got 3 tabs. I've got an Explore tab, I've got a Flights tab, I've got a Trips tab. Okay, so that appears at the top and kind of looks like it's almost blended in with the application bar. Okay. What happens, what you see beneath that is then dependent on the tab, right? So the main content of the screen changes based on which tab you select, okay? Now, it is important that when you switch tabs, we don't want to call start activity because that creates transitions and all these kind of things. So this actually all has to be contained in a single activity, okay? In a single activity, which kind of gets us into some issues, right? So if we think about how we've laid things out and hidden and shown things, imagine what would happen if I had to put 3 screens worth of layout all in one constraint layout. That would be a nightmare, wouldn't it? Right? So I don't want to do that, right? I want to have each of these tabs have their own separate layouts. A layout for trips, a layout for flights, and a layout for Explore. They can all have their own separate layout, right? And so we just switch between which of those we show, but no, we're not actually switching between screens, right? So we're going to use, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, we're going to be switching between fragments instead of switching between activities. Okay? So that's one way you can do it. Tab navigation allows for an unlimited number of tabs. If there's more tabs that can fit on the screen, you just get a scroll bar. Okay? So you're technically allowed for this in terms of working with tabs. They appear at the top. You can have as many tabs as you want. Okay? I would say it's better not to have a very large number of tabs because that's not user-friendly, right? If you have 10 tabs and only 2 or 3 of them are visible to the user, the likelihood of them seeing the last ones or those tabs being user-friendly, yeah, forget about it. It might work on a tablet or a desktop, but it's probably not going to work to have a whole bunch of tabs on a smartphone. Cool? So we don't have to keep them small, but we would still like to keep them small. Okay? There's a really good page here. We talk about the material design guidelines. Okay? Material design guidelines, these are the main driving rules of how do you design apps for Android. Okay? Apps for Android are expected to follow the material design guidelines because that's the standard guidelines for Android. You can use these, you can apply this to building websites, you can apply it to building iOS apps. You can really apply it to anything, but it's a standard for writing Android apps. Okay? So that would also extend to things like, hey, I want to build a PWA, and that PWA, if I want to run on Android, should probably also follow the material design guidelines. Cool? So they give us some rules and some do's and don'ts for how should we use tabs and how should we not use tabs. These are really, really good documentations for you to look at and review and take a deeper dive into yourself. There's a lot of different interactive demos here, so you can even play around with them and see how the UIs work. So here they show an example of the tabs, and you can see that there's animations as I switch between those. You can see the bar, the indicator switches back and forth. I can have my tabs just be text, or I can have them with a leading icon in front of them, looks a little bit nicer, or I can do top icon like this, which makes them taller, but doesn't take up as much horizontal space. You know, depending on how long your text is, if you have long labels for your tabs, it might be better to do it this way. If your labels are pretty short, then it might be better to do it this way and take up less vertical space. Okay, but all of those are options. It's also possible to turn off the text label. If you decide you just want an icon, you can do that there as well. All of those are possible in the material sort of design guidelines. So a general recommendation here, they talk about usage. When you're using this, they say each tab can contain content that is distinct from other tabs in the set. For example, tabs can represent different sections of news, different genres of music, or different themes of documents. So what you see on the left, this one they say, yes, do that. Go ahead and do set things up like this, right? Where you have trips and flights and explore, and those are three very different screens, right? They're not going to look the same way. That's fine. On the other side, they say don't do this. Don't say each tab is a chapter in a book. That's not very user-friendly.
I've seen that before.
Yeah. It's recommended against, right? So because there's better ways to deal with things like chapters. Like it would be more sensical to maybe scroll up and down, or to use something we call a drawer, where you kind of hit that triple bar up in the top left. That expands something out, and then you can see a list of the table of contents and go through it that way. That's more preferable. So, you know, there's some guidelines here about things that you should do and things that you shouldn't do. Cool? Do pay attention to those, right? So there's some ways that you want to use tabs and some ways you don't want to use tabs just because they're not very user-friendly. Other things here, put tabs in a single row as they're associated. You know, so this is here. This is good. Dogs, cats, birds. We're shifting between different kinds of animals. It's okay. On the other side, they're saying small, medium, large. Don't do this. You know, just looking at different sizes of the product, because it doesn't make it easy for the user to compare, if that makes sense. Cool? It's kind of like you're looking at different sets of data. So there's some cases where you want to use and not use them. Looking down further, let's talk about types. Scrollable tabs, you see when they get too many, it's going to start looking like this. But you can see that it's starting to extend over to the right. I think if I go up to the example up at the top of the page, we can see the scrolling tabs there. So these ones, you can see that there's additional tabs that go off to the edge. And it can be a little bit hard to sometimes get to those, especially because this example doesn't support swiping. So it's hard for me to kind of go too much further. All right. Where was I? No, that's not where I was. I jumped and lost my place. Anatomy.
You're right there with the orange, I think.
Okay, I think it was here. So you notice here they kind of make some notes on the label. What do they say? So caution, all the label can wrap to a second line. Scrollable tabs confine text to a single row. So rather than, you know, we prefer to keep it to a single line. Here, notice that this one's really long, and the font, they've actually went and make the font size smaller. So with tabs, we want to kind of be short. We want to try to avoid having a bunch of text that's falling off. Other things we don't want to do, we don't want to have some of these be text and some of these icons. You see how this one on the right is kind of that way. Icons. What was the thing I wanted to look at? Oh, behavior. So they've got some really interesting animations here. And so behavior is an interesting section where you can see a live demo of how things behave. So here we're seeing one way that you can navigate between tabs is you can just tap on the different tab, and I'll switch you back and forth. And you can see that there's an animation that plays as you're doing it. So it's kind of swiping the screen left to right. See that? Kind of smooth animation. Another way that you can do this is the common expectation is usually you also expect the user to be able to do a horizontal swipe, and you can see how they're swiping it left and right without using the tabs. That's also an expectation if you're using tabs. Cool? Okay. So those are things that the user is expecting to be able to do in general, is if there's tabs, they can also swipe left and right to go between them. That means a few things here. Notice in this example that they've got tabs, but they also have a scroll view here or a recycler view here that's going through images, right? So unfortunately, this means if they scroll one place, they're switching tabs, and if they scroll here, they're scrolling images. We want to avoid that where possible. Okay? So that's one kind of stipulation. We want to avoid two different actions that occur, swiping left or right. So that may mean we have to make some decisions, either not to use tabs in those scenarios, or things like that. Yes.
So where it says caution, like,
Yeah.
I guess technically means that you can do that. They just
You
didn't
can do
recommend
it.
to not do that.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you could do it, and there might be some scenarios where it's the only solution, but you want to avoid it where possible. On the flip side, this one right here is listed as don't. So you'll notice if they swipe on a particular item, that this option appears up with the check mark, versus if they swipe down where there's no items, then it switches between tabs. That's a definite we don't want to, because
How is that one different from the other one? I'm kind of failing to
well,
understand that.
this one, that would, when I release that there, that's like clicking a button. Something's actually going to happen,
Oh, I see, I see.
right? When I release that swipe, then it's going to change the data. Like it might remove that from my shopping cart, or mark it down my to-do list, mark that I've read that email, or whatever it may be. It's actually going to change the data in some way, versus just swiping the tabs doesn't change the data, right? So there we may want to choose to either not implement the swiping with the items, or we might choose to not implement the swiping with the tabs.
Can you still keep the tabs without the swipe?
We can still keep the tabs without the left and right swipe. Yes, it's still possible to have the tabs, but not the swiping behavior. Okay. So yeah. So that's things to keep in mind. This one, you're just kind of changing the view state by scrolling left and right. It wasn't actually modifying data. That's the difference. Yeah.
Is there companies that ever utilize that swiping actions, like if you usually do something that they probably don't want to do it? Just like they actually like did the button or something. Or
Maybe. I think large in part that's, I don't know that I know I've seen specific case where that was an intentional choice. I think I've only seen cases where that was an accidental choice, where they didn't really think about the whole thing. It's like, oh, I have tabs and I have this thing together, so yeah. So those are kind of things to keep in mind.
That swiping on the item reminds me of Gmail. Gmail's always had that feature.
Gmail has that feature. A bunch of other apps also have that feature, actually. So also in terms of scrolling, common thing that people pay attention to is scrolling up and down. By default, those tabs and the navbar stay visible at the top, but sometimes you may want to hide some things to make it to get more screen real estate as the user's scrolling down. So one thing you can do is when users, if you play around with the scrolling behavior, you can set up in such a way that, hey, just the tabs stick around and the navbar goes away. That's okay. That's one thing that's a do. Another case here where they scroll up and both of those go away at the same time. You see both the tabs and the navbar goes away. That's both fine. That fits Mazurial guidelines. The one thing that they ask you don't do is this one, which is when you swipe up, the tabs go away and the navbar stays, where the tabs get hidden behind the navbar. That's the one you don't do. The other two are fine. Okay. So, these are things that you really need to pay attention in the design guidelines as you go further to see what some of those explanations are. Also here, there's a nice diagram of what things might look like on larger screens or different screen sizes. So for instance, when we're dealing with tabs, let's say we've got 4 tabs here. On the left, you can see in a mobile device, all the tabs are the same width, and they're occupying the full width of the screen. Versus over here on a computer, a desktop, we're having much more wider real estate. So these tabs are in the center, still the same width, but they're in the center of the screen instead. So you'll notice that there's different UIs oftentimes for these tabs, depending on how wide the screen is. Cool? It's usually not one size fits all. Because otherwise, if we'd stretch these all the way out, right? Let's say we'd stretch these on the mobile, those would be really, really wide. There'd be a lot of wasted space, Yeah.
So is that material, is that like directly from Google? Or
Yes.
just like okay.
This website is made by and maintained by Google, and a lot of the instructions about how to do Android development are also on here. So not all the documentation's on, most of the documentation's on Android developers, but also there's a lot of stuff here on the material I/O that relates to Android development. So yeah, this is maintained entirely by Google. Other cases that are acceptable too, you might, on a larger screen, you don't necessarily have to center. You might also left align the tabs. They allow for that as well. Those are both consistent. Things they say here, place it above the content, that's good. So right under the nav bar is fine, but avoid doing things like this. Generally speaking, we don't want to put two tab layers on top of each other. Don't do nested tabs like this. And we don't want to do tabs that are placed vertically. So tabs, the expectation with tabs is that they're always oriented horizontally and they're at the top of the screen. Okay? General design principles. Tabs hold the app bar. They say don't do this where they're on the same level as that. Or don't put them at the bottom. You see where we've got tabs at the bottom instead of tabs at the top. So that's some quick overview of some of those rules. You can read more into that, but I wanted to at least expose you to what is available there in terms of documentation, right? So those guidelines are very helpful. Okay, so that's one way that we can implement this peer navigation. Is we can have our home screen switching between two different tabs. So we have like a users tab and a games tab. We might switch that. Another way we can do is using bottom nav, which is very similar, but it occurs at the bottom instead of the top. But before I talk about that, let's take a quick break. So let's take a quick 15-minute break. I want to give you a chance to stretch your legs. We'll come back at 2:36. We left off talking about tab navigation. We looked at some of the design guidelines for that. Definitely pay attention to some of those rules. There's also a way to do this sort of navigation using something called bottom nav. Bottom nav is very similar to tab navigation. It just occurs at the bottom of the screen instead of the top of the screen. So at the bottom we call it bottom nav, at the top we call it tabs. At the bottom it looks kind of like this, right? So I have maybe favorites, music, places, news. It's kind of the same idea where these different sections should be distinct, separate pieces. There's some additional rules with bottom nav in that there's a hard limit of 5. You can't have more than 5 things in the bottom nav, period. So you're really looking usually at 2 to 5, or they recommend 3 to 5 things. So there's a very narrow limit of what they recommend. We also generally only use this on one screen in the entire app. Bottom nav is usually only ever used once. Tab navigation, it's fine if you use it on a bunch of different screens, but bottom nav, we use it only on the home screen, the home or the main activity. That's it. Nowhere else should it occur. That's a standard user expectation, and it's part of what goes to what it's about, right? It's really a navigation that's meant for top-level stuff that's kind of the most important to dive down further into the application. Generally, you're going to see this on phones because it's very space efficient on phones. Having this little navigation makes it really quick to get around the app, but you don't generally see it on larger screen sizes because it's not space efficient on larger screen sizes. If you just think about how this would scale, I take this little bit, this little bar that I'm taking at the bottom. It doesn't take up much space on the phone, but you blow that up to a full monitor, and now it's taking up a lot of space for at most 5 icons. So you're losing a lot more, or wasting a lot more space on there. It also just kind of doesn't look good. So generally speaking, we're going to swap out bottom nav for some other sort of navigation if you go to a tablet or larger. Does that make sense for everybody? In fact, usually on tablet or larger, we may not even do tab navigation. Oftentimes what you'll see on larger screens is we'll put it on the side. We may say, hey, here's the content, the main content of the screen, and here on the side, we do some sort of sidebar for the navigation. That would be the kind of the larger screen equivalent of the bottom nav. Cool? Make sense to everybody? Yeah.
So they behave essentially the same, they just kind of look different?
Yeah.
Okay.
In terms of bottom versus top versus tab?
Yeah.
Yeah, they just look, they behave very, very close in the user's perspective. On the code side, tab navigation and bottom nav are totally different in terms of the code, unfortunately. Yeah.
So did they both not start a new activity?
Neither of these will start a new activity.
Okay, that's what I
In
thought.
both of these cases, we're staying on the same activity and switching between different fragments.
Okay, that's what I thought.
So we're going to switch the main content out for like the favorites fragment, or the music fragment, or the places fragment, or the muses fragment, right? So rather than having those be different activities, they're different fragments. Okay. So those are the ways that you can do this. You can set up this navigation with a menu. You can set it up with tabs. You can set it up with bottom nav. What I want you to do for the project is bottom nav. Okay. So we're going to do bottom nav to switch between users and games. Okay. So let's talk about fragments, because fragments are the way that we're going to implement this. Fragments. So let's talk about what a fragment is. There's a definition here that's pulled from the docs. A fragment represents a reusable portion of your app's UI. A fragment defines and manages its own layout, has its own lifecycle, and can handle its own input events. However, fragments cannot live on their own. They can't be the top level. They can't be the entire screen. They must be hosted within an activity or another fragment. You can put fragments inside of activities, or you can put them inside of other fragments. Both of those are legal, but they can't live at the top level. The only thing that gets to live at the top level is activities. Okay? So that's why you always have to have at least one activity. That's why we call it single activity when we're talking about that. Okay? Kind of like with the web browser, you always have to have a single page, even though UI can change within that page. When you incorporate or show the fragment on the UI, all of the hierarchy that's part of that fragment becomes part of the hierarchy, part of the views that are shown to the user. They're part of the view hierarchy now. Okay, you're kind of basically attaching and detaching a kind of subtree to the activity. Okay, so an example of where this might come up. The reason that this was introduced at first is because we realized that with tablets and phones, we often need very different UIs, but they often share common UI elements. They might look fairly different, or they might look fairly similar, but there's often parts that we can kind of reuse if we didn't have to completely replace the entire activity, right? So what we say is, well, maybe we can break this down. So maybe we have, here's a list with some bottom navigation. That's what it looks like on the phone. Versus here's that list with a different kind of navigation on a tablet, right? So that way I can set this up with these fragments. Here I've got 3 different kinds of fragments, or 3 different kinds of views. Here's the list fragment. I can use it either side. Here it's got 2 columns, there it's got 1. Here I've got, this is a separate just bottom nav view, and maybe this is just a drawer view, right? But I can reuse the list or details or whatever it may be in both of those cases. It's very common that you see something like a master detail flow, what we call it, where we've kind of got this set up already, where on phones, you might see here on the phone, you've got the list is one screen. You click an item, and that takes you to details. Or on a tablet, you can do the same UI like this, where you put it all on one screen. Pretty common because it's like, oh, well, I don't need to have this be two separate screens. I can just pick an item from the list over here and have it pop up like that. Gmail and Outlook both work that way on tablets, if you have them in landscape mode. So they'll switch between that. That is really hard to do if you just have activities. It's really a huge pain in the butt. But with Fragments, this becomes fairly easy because Fragments kind of divorce you from the fact that these are two separate screens or these are a common screen. I just say, hey, I've got a list fragment, and I can either have that be the entire screen, or I can have it be part of the screen. I can have a details fragment, which is part of the screen, or the whole screen, or part of it. So we're breaking things down into smaller pieces. I like to kind of give the analogy, oftentimes, that fragments are sort of like mini activities. They're like smaller activities, right? They're a smaller piece of UI. But in a lot of ways, they behave like activities. In a lot of ways, fragments are like activities. They just have a different life cycle, right? So remember with activities, we've got this kind of, they're created, we've got onCreate, we've got onDestroy. There's a lot of lifecycle methods on fragments as well, but they're different names and they have different timings, okay? So for instance, one of the things that's a common gotcha is that when I put an activity, if I have an activity come on screen, the first thing that's called is onCreate, okay? It's not kind of the same flow with a fragment. The fragment first gets created, and then it gets attached to the activity, and then the views get generated, and then we can write our code. So the point at which where we do the actual code that we're used to writing in onCreate is a little bit later. And also because activities can be attached and detached, so like as you're switching between bottom navs, we may be creating and destroying these fragments. It's possible that the onCreate's called multiple times without you leaving the screen. So their life cycle is a little bit different is one thing to keep in mind. Cool? And when they're created and destroyed is not exactly the same. You can find more about this on the Fragments overview, but you can kind of understand what we're trying to do. This is really, really helpful when you're trying to have different UIs between mobile and tablet, phones and tablet. So here's an example of what it might look like to create a fragment, okay? So I create a fragment class. We're going to say public class example fragment extends fragment, okay? I have a constructor. In that constructor, I'm going to specify the layout for the constructor, layout for the for this fragment. So it's got its own layout. Kind of the same way as you design an activity. You can take a layout that you would typically put in the activity, like the game list or the user list, and say that's now the layout for this fragment instead of the layout for an activity. From there, we have a onViewCreated. Notice the naming change, right? We did onCreated with the activities, but we have over the equivalent to onCreate in the fragment world is onViewCreated. That's basically where you put the same kind of code. That's where we're going to put all the find view IDs, all the registering the listeners and setting things up and creating view models, etc. Right? That's really the difference. Right? The difference between an activity and a fragment in server code is you extend fragments instead of extending an activity, and you're going to put all of your code that you put in onCreate. Basically, most of it's going to go here in onViewCreated and stuff. So the transition isn't that hard, right? Fragments and activities have a lot in common. So the transitioning something from a fragment to from an activity to a fragment is overall usually pretty simple. Okay. I would definitely recommend. I linked this to. There's an article called Create a Fragment. There's more information in here you can look at in terms of the code. I would recommend looking at that if you need to know more. Things to note here. Your fragment must be embedded within a fragment activity. Okay. If you're going to show a fragment on screen, it has to be inside of a fragment activity. Fragment activity says this is an activity that can have fragments. The reason for that distinction is on older devices do not support fragments. Originally, activities did not support fragments. So you have to have a newer device in order to support fragments. By newer device, I mean Android 4.4, if I remember right, is the number, is the transition. So they've actually been around for a long time, and so at this point we can kind of assume everybody can support fragments. Good news is that app-compat activity, which we're already using, already gets used anytime you create a new activity. That's already a subclass of fragment activity, so there's actually nothing we have to do there because we've already got that part set up. So we're already using app-compat activity for that backward compatibility. It's already subclass of fragment. You don't have to worry about that. There's two ways you can add the fragment to the view hierarchy or get it on screen. You can either do that in the layout for the activity through XML, or you can do it programmatically. Right? So if you know, hey, I know ahead of time this fragment's always going to be here, it's never going to change, I can just code that in to the layout of the activity. But more often than not, it is going to change, so we'll have to change that fragment programmatically. We'll have to say, okay, well, when this happens, I want to change which fragment. I want to put a new fragment here into this spot. Okay. Historically, we used to do that with a frame layout. Historically, we used to drop the activity as the child of a frame layout. That has had some issues and that has had some bugs, so it's not recommended anymore. Instead, they recommend if wherever you show the fragment, that you use a fragment container view or some subclass of fragment container view. And so that's going to define the location of where we're going to put a fragment into the view hierarchy. We're going to use a fragment container view. As I mentioned here, strongly recommend you use that over frame layout because there's some bug fixes that they've added to that. And you don't get those bug fixes if you don't use that. Okay? So to do this program, do this in the XML, you say, hey, instead of a frame layout or whatever, I put a fragment container view that's going to say, here's a placeholder, here's a spot where I can attach a fragment. And I can specify the android.name property to point to my fragment class. So if I put it in this way, it will always be there, right? So I'll say, hey, I always want this fragment here. Okay, good. That might occur in cases like this with the master detail flow, where it might say, hey, the layout, landscape layout list is always on the left. Things like that. Okay, or this one, the list fragment's always there, details fragment's always there, things like that. If I don't know it ahead of time or it might change, then instead of setting android.name, I'm going to not set it here. So by default, it will just be white empty space. And then in code, I'm going to programmatically put the appropriate fragment in there, okay, or change it. So the way we do that is we use this support fragment manager. Support meaning it works with older devices. It's working with some compatibility issues. So we grab the support fragment manager. We call begin transition, begin transaction. Transaction says, I need to make a change to the fragments that are currently on screen. And then I'm going to call add. I'm going to say I'm going to add a fragment to fragment container, create an instance of example fragment class, pass in these arguments, we're good to go. Quick mention on the arguments. The arguments is a bundle object. Bundle object is the same as what we're doing with extras. When you push extras into an intent, that is a bundle. So it's the same kind of thing, where you can put in ints and strings and other primitive types, and then read them out on the other side when the fragment gets started. So it's kind of like, those arguments are kind of like what we do with an intent. Okay? Same rules apply. So we might pass IDs or just little pieces of information. And then finally, I'll call commit. That's what actually puts it on screen, right? So this is how you can programmatically show a fragment. Okay? It's a bit of code there, but overall it's pretty simple. Cool. So that's how we can programmatically switch which fragments show. So I might do that something like, okay, well let's show this fragment, the game list initially, and then when the user clicks a button on the nav bar, on the bottom nav, we switch to either the user list or the game list, right? So we can call this again. Here we're calling add, so notice we're adding a new one. You can also call remove to remove any fragments that are already there. Cool. Part of the benefit of doing this as a transaction and a commit is it allows for you to do animations. Because it's like, oh, you want to remove this and add that, and you can specify how to animate between those two. Cool. Actually, it turns out as just like with, remember with React and single page applications, part of the benefit of doing single page applications is it makes it easy to transition, to do animations between different things. That's where these fragment transactions come in place. It allows us to easily transition from one fragment to another. Okay? All right. So that's a quick overview of the code that you need to know related to fragments. Okay? There's a bunch of other information that you can read. Fragment overview, create a fragment, fragment manager, fragment transactions. You can read about their life cycle. You can read about different ways to communicate with that fragment. One of the things they mentioned communicating with fragments is view models. View models are kind of the new way that we do the communication. So these are places to get some more information. You may need that information as you're working through this. Cool? I'm not going to go too much into that right now. But those are the more background behind what we're just doing here. So now we've talked about what a fragment is. Again, fragment's kind of a mini activity. We're going to talk about how we can use that to implement our navigation. Okay. So namely, I'm going to talk about how to use that to implement both tab navigation and bottom navigation. Okay. But there's a lot of different ways that you could use this. Okay. So for instance, with tab navigation, this has kind of been, there's a new version. There's an implement tab navigation with tab layout and view pager 2, because there's, actually it turns out there was recently released a new version of this view pager component that we'll use. Okay. And it walks you through how to start this process and how to implement this sort of paging with tabs. Okay. I've made an example project called tab navigation. And maybe I'll start that up real quick and just so I can show you. Actually, I have it running. So what it looks like is this. I've got 5 tabs, and I can switch between them here.
Can you screen share this, Mr.
Did I not? Okay. I thought I still have my screen sharing going. Of that note, let me make sure I am on Ethernet, wide network. Okay. So I can switch between tabs, and you can see the animation there. The other thing I can do is swipe left and right, and you can see the animation with it swiping left and right, and that also changes the tabs, right? So this is the first example that we'll look at, right, where I've got these 5 different tabs. And this is based on this tutorial. Mind you that there actually is a decent amount of code that I've changed from the tutorial. So you can find this on GitHub. It's in my movie list repository. If you follow that link, you'll get to it. But it's under Firebase Movie List 2022. It's the tab navigation project. And we'll look at the code in a bit. Okay. So talk about swipe views, what we're using here to switch back and forth. This allows you to navigate between sibling screens. So you can see there's kind of 5 sibling screens or 5 sibling tabs with a horizontal gesture or swipe. And this is also called as horizontal paging or horizontal navigation. We're navigating between peers, as you can see, because they're all at the same level. And if you look at that article and what we're going to talk about here, this is going to teach you how to implement that using both a tab layout as well as a view pager. Okay, so we're going to talk about how we combine those 2 elements. Now, in order to use these elements, in order to use view pager in order to use tab layout, we need to add 2 dependencies. Okay, I'm going to add a dependency on Android X fragment. Okay, Reason for that dependency is kind of I skipped over. There's actually 2 fragment classes in Android now. There's the old fragment class, which has been with us for a while, and there's a new Jetpack fragment that they've added recently to fix some issues. And so we'll be using the new fragments, and to use those new fragments, we need to have Android X fragment. Okay? So that's one of the dependencies we're going to have to add to the project. The other dependency we need to add to the project is Android X ViewPager 2, and that's going to enable us to use this ViewPager 2 control. Okay? So those 2 dependencies we're going to need to add to the Gradle for the project you're working on. Cool? All right, next up. Here's what the layout looks for. Where we want to start is before we get to the activities, we want to start implementing the fragments themselves. Okay? So the layout for the fragment looks like this. It's just a linear layout with the text view inside of it, and you can see I've raised the font size to 100 SP. So that's what I'm doing there to make it look as it is. Just a super simple, just a placeholder to see that it's working, right? In terms of the code for that fragment, looks like this. So you see I'm got an example page fragment. It's a subclass of fragment. That's the Android X fragment. I've got a constructor. You can see in the constructor I'm telling it to go to fragment page. That's the layout for it. The layout that we saw just above. And then in onViewCreated is where I'm doing the majority of the logic. So for instance, I'm going to get arguments. So I'm going to say call require arguments. So it's going to return the bundle. It's going to throw an exception if the arguments were not passed. From there, we're going to ask for the position argument. Okay, save that as that's an integer. I'm going to save that. I'm going to find the text view that I put in the layout, and I'm going to show that number there. Right. So this code should look very similar to you. It should look almost identical to what we've done with activities. Right. It's kind of the same idea. Right. The difference is we specify the layout in that constructor, and we use onViewCreated instead of onCreated. Cool. Okay. So that's how this one's set up. We also need to add in an adapter. This is a special kind of adapter. Okay, so previously we've created 2 kinds of adapter. We've created recycler view adapters, which we use to show things in a recycler view. We've also created another kind, an array adapter to use with our spinners. This is a 3rd kind of adapter. Okay, so you can see this class is a subclass of fragment state adapter. Okay, fragment state adapter, I wish they'd given it another name because it's not really a good name for what this is. What it really is it's a way to say, okay, I've got a bunch of pages, say, which is what we're using with the view page. We're swiping between pages. And so what it does, it takes you from what page do you want? Page 0, page 1, page 2. It takes you from the index of the page to an actual fragment object. That's what it's there for. It converts you from an index to fragments. You can also set up these things to convert from, say, a list of objects into a list of pages. You can do that. But that's not usually what we do. Okay. So you can see it's got a similar sort of interface, right? Remember with the recycler view, we had to implement the get item count, the create view holder, as well as the bind view holder methods. Okay. So there's 2 methods you have to create for this kind of adapter. You have to create a get item count, which returns how many pages are here. So here I'm saying there are 5 pages. I'm just hard coding that in. And I've got a create fragment method. So we say, okay, given the position, create a fragment for that page. So we're going to create an example page fragment, which we defined previously, and create a new fragment. I'm going to create this bundle, which is the arguments. And I'm going to put the position in there. So we have the position where it's in. I can put some data in there. I'm going to call fragment set arguments. It's going to put those arguments in there. And finally, I return the fragment. You can kind of think of this as almost identical to, it's kind of a mix between onCreate view holder and onBind view holder. It's kind of doing both jobs. Cool? Make sense so far? So we've got these additional, if we want to do the switching, whether it be from the view of doing tabs, or whether it be from doing bottom nav. If we want to be able to swipe left and right, we need one of these. Okay, that's what turns the pages into fragments. Okay. Next up, let's talk about the activity itself. Okay, so in terms of the activity, I've got pretty simple. Just for simplicity of the code, I've done a linear layout. So the linear layout contains the tab layout and the view pager. Okay, so the tab layout is going to appear at the top. The view pager is going to appear at the bottom. You can see I've got a weight of 1 and height of 0, so it's going to be stretched to take the rest of the available space, right? So we take a little bit of space for the tab layout at the top, the rest of the space for view pager. That's all that's on this screen. It's just the tab layout and the view pager. Okay. The implementation of that activity looks like so. So I've got some references. I've got some instance variables. One instance variable for the tab layout, one instance variable for the pager, and a third one to store the adapter. Okay. First thing I need to do, so I'm going to expand the layout, activity main. I'm going to find the two views that are in there, the tabs, and the pager. I need to create this adapter, which we just talked about. I'm going to create that. I'm going to pass in this. One thing I kind of skimmed over that I need to mention, notice that this adapter has two constructors. One that takes a fragment activity and one that takes a fragment. Okay. Why do I have two constructors? Well, the first one is if I need to put this fragment inside of an activity, these fragments inside of an activity. The second one that takes a fragment is if I want to put a fragment inside of a fragment. So by adding those both constructors, it allows me to use that adapter in either context. Cool? In this case, I'm only using the first constructor, but it's a good habit to always just make both. That's good for future-proofing yourself. So we're calling that constructor, creating the adapter, and then kind of like I did with a recycler view, I'm telling the pager, here's my adapter. So now the pager knows, okay, there's five screens, and I can construct the fragment for each of those 5 screens. So as you swipe left and right, it will call to the adapter and create the appropriate fragment. So really nice thing here, we kind of talked about previously the fragment manager and the transactions. If I'm not using this view pager, I have to manually do all that switching. But view pager already deals with the swiping for you and will switch between the appropriate fragments. Cool. This is kind of, in a lot of ways, the view pager is very similar to a recycler view. It just switches between screens or fragments instead of scrolling through a list of items. Cool. Okay. Next thing up, I'm going to create a tab layout mediator. What this is going to do is it's going to sync the selected tab with the selected page. By default, if I don't have this tab layout mediator, if I just scroll through the pages, or if I go through the tabs, it doesn't change the opposite thing. But by adding this in, that will make them be synced up. So in order to create a mediator, I need to pass in both the tab layout and the pager, so we can sync those two things. It also needs a little quick function here, and this quick lambda function is just going to actually fill in the text. So it's going to name the tabs. So tab 0, tab 1, tab 3, etc. So part of the tab mediator also, oddly, its job is also to create the tabs themselves. If I didn't have that in there, then there actually would be no tabs in the layout. In fact, I can show that real quick if I go to the example. So let me pull up that project. Let me comment out what I've got here. And so if I didn't have that mediator there, and comment that out and run it, what you would see is I can swipe left or right, but the tabs weren't populated, and even if they were populated, they wouldn't be synced up, right? So the mediator is both populating the available tabs and making them be synced. Okay. And last thing I have to remember, after I create the tab meteor, I have to actually attach it to both things. If I don't call attach it, it's like you created a dialog or a snack bar and never actually showed it. There's no effect if you don't attach it. So that's kind of the quick summary of setting that up. Okay. Questions right now? Does that kind of make sense as a starting point, switching between tabs? Okay. Now, there's a problem with this example. There's a problem with this example. Go back to running this with the mediator in there. This isn't really like what you're building. It's similar, right? It's got tabs, you're switching between them, you're swiping left and right. But it's not really like what you're building. Why do I say that? Well, all the tabs are the same, which is not really the thing you're building, right? In fact, generally speaking, when we're building tab navigation or bottom nav, the different screens that we're switching between are going to be vastly different. They're not going to be common at all, right? So this example, unfortunately, it kind of demonstrates the concepts, but doesn't really help you in the actual problem that you generally want to solve, right? Which is that they're completely different. Now, the grains are kind of there, right? If you twist it the right way, you can maybe see, oh, okay, well maybe if I go into my adapter and rather than say, hey, I'm always going to create this particular fragment, maybe I put in some sort of switch statement. And I say if it's position 0, then I'm going to create this kind of fragment. Or if it's position 1, I'm going to create this kind of fragment. So you can kind of, the guts are kind of there, right? But it's not really like what you want to build, okay? So what I want to show you is a slightly different example with using tabs with two screens that are actually different, actually distinct, right? So if you're pulling up my project, go ahead and take a look at this. I'm going to pull it up here and we're going to talk about the code. So under my movie list, I've got a project called Tab Navigation 2. And I'm going to go ahead and run this, and we can see what this is doing. So I've got two tabs, movies and users. It's starting me out on the movies tab. I can swipe over to the users tab. I can use the tabs switch, which is a lot closer to what we're actually trying to do, right? I'm not trying to switch between tab 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm trying to switch between tab movies and tab users, and these should be totally different, right? They shouldn't really necessarily have much in common, okay? So on the one hand, these projects are somewhat similar, but in reality, if you look at how they're architected, there's a lot of different choices, a lot of different decisions that are made to kind of build this out, okay? So I'm going to walk you through how this is constructed, okay? So going back to my slides, and I kind of mentioned this in the material design guidelines. If you look under tabs and usage, I kind of mentioned this, that we looked at this. We usually, the do is you represent it as different, completely different things, versus the don't is don't do chapter 1, chapter 0, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, which unfortunately is exactly what their code example does, is chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, and not the thing you usually want to do. So the way that I start this out is I start by creating two separate layouts and two separate fragment classes. Now, looking real quick at the example code, we can take a look at the layouts. There's not really much to see there, but we can take a look at them just for illustration purposes. So the movie list is one layout. the user list is another layout. They're just two completely separate layouts. Here for simplicity, I've used linear layout and text, but there's no reason they can't be like constraint layouts and whatever you want them to be. They can be absolutely any kind of layout you need it to be. Okay, so I need to implement two different fragments. One fragment for each tab, okay? So I've got a movie list fragment and I've got a user list fragment. So rather than having a movie list activity or a movie list and a user list activity, I have two fragments instead of two activities. That's really the difference, okay? So I create these two activities. Whatever code I needed to put in, I would put here. Whatever code I need to put in to populate, recycle, view, and do all those kind of things, that's what I would put in here. The adapter is going to look similar, not exactly the same. Again, I've got two constructors, calling this the main page extractor, or you can call it the home page adapter. One that takes an activity, one that takes a fragment, depending on how you're hosting. Right? Get item count, you can see always returns 2, because I have 2 tabs. Right? So if I had 3 tabs, I'd say return 3. Right? But I'm just saying, okay, I know ahead of time how many tabs I have, so return 2. Here, I'm going to write the create fragment function. You can see I've got a switch statement in here. So I'm saying based on the position, create this type of fragment. So if we're on position 0, create the movie list fragment. If we're on position 1, create the user list fragment. And then if we're anything else, the default case is just throw an exception. Index out of bounds, because this adapter only has 2 tabs or 2 pages. Make sense? Really simple, but very different than the first example, right? So this is actually usually how your adapters will look. It's usually like this with a switch statement, not like the first example I showed. Cool? Okay. Let's look at the activity layout. Same thing, tab layout, and then a view pager. In terms of the activity, again, very similar. I've got instance variables for the tabs, the pager, and the adapter. I go find where views I might prepare views. I create the adapter. I set up a mediator. You'll notice a little switch with the mediator. And the first thing I do is create an array of strings, which is the names of those tabs. So in here, I'm going to have getString, movie list page, getString, user list page. So I'm getting those 2 strings that represent the name of the tab so I can translate them. And then from here, in that little arrow function, I say tab set text, tab names position. Right? So I'm pulling the name of that tab from that array. Not attention. Easy peasy. Make sense? Pretty simple, right? So setting up a pager, setting up a set of tabs, connecting together it's not too bad, right? There's some new concepts, right? So you have to deal with fragments. You have to move your code out of your activity and start moving the code to fragments. But you'll start noticing that the activity has even less code in it than it did before, right? If you had a bunch of code to deal with the user list, all of that user list or all that game list code is now in the fragment instead of being in the activity itself. Everybody see that? So the activity basically contains almost no logic. Right? All of this is strictly related to the UI. Cool. But I did have to add some additional classes, right? So in total to make this work, how many classes did I need for this? Well, I needed 2 fragments, an adapter, and the activity. So I had four activities, 4 classes, just to set this up.
For each additional tab, you need another 2?
For every tab, you need another one.
Another 1.
Right. I just need 1 more fragment, right? If I want to add a 3rd tab, all I've got to do from this point on is just add another fragment. So that was pretty easy. Okay. So let's talk about what this looks like from the perspective of bottom navigation. So we just talked about how to do tabs. I wanted to talk about how to do bottom navigation. Bottom navigation is very similar. Except that how we kind of populate the options is a little bit different. So the way you populate a bottom nav is you use a menu. Remember, we've previously set a menu to put in the top bar. We put our sign out buttons and our profile buttons up there. So to create the options that appear on the bottom now, I need a new menu. I'm going to call this, I think I called this in the project, this under bottom navigation project, menu bottom navigation. It's got 2 items in here. The first item is for the movie list. The second item is for the user list. You can see I need an ID for each of the items, each of the menu items. I need a string, which is going to be the title. That's going to be the text that shows. And I also want an icon for each of those. Again, almost identical to the menu resource that we used at the top. Make sense? So this is not too much new. It's just that I'm using it for the bottom of the screen instead of the top of the screen. Then, looking at the activities layout is also pretty simple. Instead of having tab layout and view pager, I have view pager and bottom nav. Cool? Make sense? Super simple layout. I just need to put those 2 pieces in. So view pager is where we're going to show the actual pages, the actual data. Bottom nav is how we're going to navigate around it. Going to the activity class, okay. Up at the top, I've got a reference to the pager, the bottom nav, and the adapter again. I get a reference I call find view by ID to get both of those things. I'm going to create the adapter, hook it up to the pager, and here's where things get a little bit different. So outside of, the first difference you saw with bottom nav is I need to use a menu to populate the options. Tabs don't use a menu, but bottom nav does. To link them up, there is no mediator class. You kind of have to implement the mediator stuff yourself. So what we do is we create a pair of listeners. One listener that listens for when you change the page, and one listener that listens for when you click on an item in the bottom nav. Cool? So I register a listener for pager. You can see this is a view pager to on-page change callback. In the on-page selected method, it tells me what position the user switched to. So this gets called when the user swipes to the left or right. Okay? I'm going to tell the bottom nav, grab its menu, grab the item at that position, and mark it as checked. What that's going to do is highlight it, mark it as active in the bottom nav. Cool? Simple as that. So if you swipe left and right, we just need to update the bottom nav to reflect that. This is the reverse. If you click an item in the bottom nav, then we need to change the page in the pager. So I add to bottom nav, I add another listener. This will give us the particular menu item that you clicked on. This is kind of like the on item selected method. So I'm going to say, okay, let's go get the item ID. If it is action maybe list, then we're going to switch the pager to page 0. And if you clicked on action user list, then we'll switch to page 1. Done. And finally, I have an else case here after return false to just say, hey, we didn't have a menu item for that case. Right, so return true if there is a menu item there, if we handled it, return false if we didn't handle it. Questions? Does that kind of make sense? Let me go pull up the demo because I didn't actually pull up the demo so you could see it. So let me go to bottom navigation. Let me hit OK. Let me go run this. And so you can see just a slightly different UI. I click the items left and right, or I swipe left and right. Cool. Questions? Make sense?
So the menu needs its own layout, right?
So the menu, the menu is a menu resource. So if you look under menu bottom nav, it's a separate XML file.
I keep thinking XML. Okay,
Yeah, it's an XML file. It is not a layout, it's a menu. Make sense? Questions? Do you have the kind of full picture now of what we're trying to do? Maybe? That's as much for the theory. Do we wait and maybe look a little bit about how to do the transition to bottom nav? I want to let you guys take care of the database stuff, but maybe we want to look a little bit about how to do this bottom nav transition. The good news is you should be able to look at this small project, this bottom navigation project, and see all the code you need. So that should help you kind of get there without having too much to look at. Because it's like, well, I'm going to have to change a decent amount of code in the project. I don't want to mix, like, here's the project stuff with the actual theory. Okay? Sometimes you have to create these test projects separate.